like to welcome you to this webinar today. RenWeb is our host and co-sponsor of this webinar series. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and we're pleased to have you joining us for this Crisis Coach webinar series. Today, we're talking about our intelligence network. Take a good look at yourself. Our presenter is Jim Satterfield. He's the president, COO, and co-founder of Firestorm. This is the 9th in the series of webinars this year, and we invite you to go to firestorm.com, where you can watch recordings of past webinars, and you can register for future webinars that we're having through the rest of the year. We invite you also to become our friend. Be our Facebook friend at Firestorm Solutions. Follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. And there is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind, though, that the presentation today is not complete without the oral comments and discussion, and the work product must be read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. And this information should not be considered or interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have a wonderful relationship with the RenWeb organization. They are the host and the co-sponsor and underwriter of this webinar series. Jim, over to you for some nice things to say about RenWeb, please.
Well, that's easy. I could talk a long time, but Shannon would normally be doing this from RenWeb today, or Ginger, but they had a meeting and they're all tied up into that, so I'm looking forward to speaking with you today. And I know that you all have in common the RenWeb system, and there's certain components of it that can be used before, during, and after a crisis. And we'll take another webinar on another day and talk about those in more depth. What we want to do today is to talk more about your organization and where you are going with it. And we thank RenWeb for the opportunity to work and speak at the annual conference, the user group. And if you have not attended one of the user group conferences, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It's a great opportunity to network and get to meet others. My name is Jim Satterfield, and I'm president and founder of Firestorm. So as you know, we've talked a lot in the past, particularly in July and August, and Karen Mazzullo, who's our EVP and Chief Information Officer, shared with you a lot of information around intelligence networks and listening and then doing the virtual investigations as we carry forward and learning what's going on within your school. But as we take a step back, we really want to look at this process a little bit more and take a look at our school and our plans. How does all of this come together? Now, if you look at the pie chart there, you know what you know. That's an easily clear identification group. Then there's a section about, you know, in some areas what it is you don't know. And you've got plans and processes in place that can help you with those areas. But that big orange section is really where we're going to focus today. What do you know? How do you know what you don't know? And so we're going to try to give you some things that you can begin to do in your school to start to evaluate where your plans are and the steps that you need to take to be prepared before, during, and after a crisis. So if we're going to think about trying to fill in that orange block some and make that a smaller percentage than what it appears to be in the slide, let's talk about how we would do that. And the cycle that you see on your screen are activities that you can do to begin to start to reduce that unknown area. You can start out with a self-assessment. RenWeb has paid to have a self-assessment done with you around where your plans are relative to standards and best practices. It'll take about 45 minutes to an hour, and then you get a findings report, and it might give you actions and where you need to go. And the good news is it doesn't cost you or your school any to do that. A step above that is a benchmark gap analysis. That's where You look in specifically at your plans, figure out what's missing, what else needs to be done. Is the plan actionable or not? Does it talk about what you need to do and miss explaining how you need to do it? And so that type of analysis is a more in-depth based upon interviews, looking at your campus and looking specifically at the detail within your plans and how you've trained and how you tested. Next up from that would be a risk analysis, a vulnerability threat assessment of your campus and of your school and of your program, looking at what those are. And we're going to give you a tool to help with that in today's webinar, and we'll go through that in depth. Additionally, to looking at what the threats and vulnerabilities and risk are, you want to look at the impacts that those would have on your school. The term of art there is called a business impact analysis, understanding the financial, operational, human impacts that would be in place within your school. Once you understand the risk and the impacts, then it's easy to begin the process of focusing on what are your strategies, what are you going to be doing, and then moving those strategies into actionable plans moves from the what into the how. Then after you have those things in place, you want to focus on what are your communications, what messages are you going to send for each one of the threats and vulnerabilities that you've identified, and how are those messages tailored for each stakeholder group? What are you going to tell students or parents or teachers associated with it for that particular risk and exposure? And what medium are you going to use? Is this a page announcement that would go out? Is it an email? Is it a cell call? Is it a text message? How are you going to communicate those threats and vulnerabilities and risk and actions? Then it's training and awareness, and the training not only of your staff but of your students. And we're going to talk also and give you a tool around the awareness and activation in today's conversation as we go through this. Then the exercises and testing, and it's more than a fire drill. It's, by the way, last month we did virtual test exercises, and we had several hundred businesses and schools participate. We did one virtual exercise for business and one for schools, and we broke down a series of activities, and the schools that participated had their team sitting around a conference table or in a classroom, and they were experiencing making those decisions. What is it they know? What are they concerned about? What are they going to do? What are they going to monitor? What are they going to say within looking through that process? I would encourage you to, the next time we announce one of those virtual exercises, that would be a wonderful event to have your team around the table and doing it. Even in the meantime, I would take elements of your plans and test those on a regular basis. And the type of testing we're talking about is more than a fire drill. Even an armed intruder in test, if you're looking at that, most schools are testing only if the students are in the classroom, not with an armed intruder or with students outside the building. So planning your test gives you the proof that you know what you're to do and your people are ready to respond when they're needed. And then finally, you have to maintain and update your plans. It's with turnover, additions, growth, it's important that you keep those updated and together at each step along the way. So as we go forward from here, we really are looking at creating an intelligence network, and that was the webinars from July and August. And the whole idea is knowing before now. You've heard me say in some of our earlier webinars that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. If it's coming to you as a surprise, it's generally not good. And so anything you can do to get that information before it becomes critical, before now, is really where the emphasis is going to come together. Now, we've asked you this question before. Can you identify your organization's next crisis? Can you identify your school's next crisis? And the answer is you must be able to do that. It doesn't matter if Firestorm can, but the focus is you must be able to do it so that you know that you're ready to handle those situations. And the way we do that is following the predict, plan, perform that you've heard us discuss in many of the webinars, but we're going to spend a little time going through that and using it as a way to organize our thoughts. So when we think about predict, plan, and perform, the predict is to understand what the vulnerabilities and threats are, what are their impacts, how are we going to monitor, and the specific triggers that are going to cause us to activate our plans. And again, we'll go through some tools that will help us do that in just a few minutes. In addition to understanding those, that monitoring and having the triggers, because if we see it start to happen, then we can take action, and we'll describe that also. The plans all relate into what we do once the problem that we have predicted arises. It could be an emergency plan with following the standard protocol of shelter in place, evacuate, lockout, lockdown. It could go beyond the emergency into the communicable illness or the crisis management structure of making decisions. It could also relate into physical security or a program of identifying behaviors of concerns, a behavioral risk threat analysis program. By the way, the acronym for that is BERTHA, and we see this as the emerging best practice in dealing with those behaviors of concern and the workplace violence and bullying types of episodes that you see in your school. And then finally, the physical security, cybersecurity, any of these areas would all be plans that would need to be developed. The perform is the training, the exercises, getting the emergency supplies in place, making sure that you are monitoring for all the threats that were identified, and then finally, being able to manage the crisis that would come forward within that area. So as we think about that methodology, let's talk about what's next. And while it's great that we've been talking about intelligence network and monitoring, it's not the only answer. In order for that intelligence network to really be effective, the threats must be clearly understood. We have to know what it is that we're looking to monitor for. We're helping several schools at the start of the school year across the country that have run into difficulties already. We've had a head of school terminated for child pornography. We've had another terminated for inappropriate contact. We've had bullying and cyberbullying, and we've had activities between a teacher and a student that has led to charges and involvement. So when you start looking at all of these things together, understanding those threats and what we're monitoring for will tell us when we need to activate our plans and the decisions that we need to carry forward. They need to be discussed so that everybody's on the same page. When you see certain activities going over, we want to already have a system in place of how do we deal with this, how do we deal with the actions that need to be taken at that point, and have those elements documented. And finally, all of this has to be done in advance with the specific activities and the training to make sure we're ready to respond to that type of a threat. So if we're going to do those things, where do we start? Well, the activities have to be an awareness-related basis. And we'll show you how you start to educate your students and your teachers on what to look for, that there'll be clearly defined communications escalations. Once we get to this point, this is the message that we're going to send. And intervention procedures to de-escalate the impacts or to protect those that are involved. Notification could be a page that goes out. It could be a blast email or text message or phone calls. How do we get those messages out to the parties so they're ready to act at the appropriate level? And then finally, that there's a defined decision process and involvement. We're seeing plans fail because they haven't thought through how do we make this decision at this point in time. We had a school where two students were suspended, another was expelled. They allowed the expelled student to come back to school, and when he did, that triggered the victim of the activities that had been taking place, the parents, to go to the police, and as a result of that, now there's a major problem. But the decision to allow the student to come back to school wasn't formalized. They didn't have a defined program in place. They didn't use an outside service like a forensic psychologist or a psychiatrist to determine that the student was no longer a risk to themselves or others. So determining these decision processes, whether it's closing the school or evacuating or allowing the student to return, need to be established and planned in advance. In addition, as we think about this, there are 5 common failures that we see in every disaster and a crisis. And you see those up on the screen right now. The first is failure to control critical supply chains. Who are the suppliers for your school? Do you have someone supplying security guards or cleaning or food services? Are there other elements that are involved in running your school that you need to have in place? Do they have plans? Are they doing the background checks that they need to do to make sure that you have as safe a school environment as possible? Then second is the failure to train employees for working at home. And across businesses and schools, we find that 70% of the employees have not been trained. So that means only 30% of your people really know what you want them to do in a crisis or in a particular situation. And 95% don't have disaster plans at home. Having a plan at home is a building block for a plan at work, because if you don't, and there's an area-wide event, you're forcing your teachers to choose between their family and their job, and family trumps job. Also, training for a plan at home helps to make everyone's awareness level higher to be ready to do the programs that need to be done. The good news is you can go to the Firestorm website and download a book called Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America. That book's about building a plan at home, and so you can get that downloaded off the website at no cost. Or if you want to use that as a fundraiser, we can print the book and you can give out copies of the book. We can even print a version with the school's plan blown in as a separate chapter into it, so it becomes a fundraiser for the school to help fund some of the programs that you're trying to instill. Third is the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risk. And we tend to see the obvious ones if you're in a floodplain, or if you're in an area that has severe winter storms, or you might have tornado exposures and others, but we tend to miss some of the others, like cyber breach or some of the business risks that face us in our schools. And we'll share some more thoughts around it, but across the board, we fail to monitor for the risks that we've already identified. Think about that for a minute. This is likely to occur, but I have no idea if it's about to occur. So the key element here is building a monitoring program for every risk and threat that you've identified. And the intelligence networks that we've been talking about play a key role there, because what we find is that problems in many cases are discussed first on social media before they're discussed in the real world. And if someone has ill intent, the percentages are very staggering. 80% of the time someone else knows, and 67% of the time, 2/3 know, 2 or more people know. So imagine if you've got a student that's contemplating suicide, high probabilities that someone else knows. If someone's involved in cutting, someone else is being a bully, either in the real world or the cyber world, other people know. And if we know that, we can intervene before it escalates into violence or death. Next to last is testing and updating your plans. You don't test your plans, you won't know how they work, your people won't be prepared, and they have to be updated as you've had turnover, as you've added new people. Understanding what's going on makes a significant difference. And last is the failure to develop a crisis communications plan. What are our key messages to each stakeholder group for each vulnerability or threat that we see? Having those identified in advance accelerates our ability to get the word out when time really matters. That becomes extremely critical for us in each of these areas. So planning that message out. So if this happens, here's what we're going to tell students. If this happens, here's what we're going to tell parents. This happens, here's what we're going to tell our teachers. And then what's the method of that communication? Is this a text message going out? Is it something we're going to do one-on-one? Are we doing it in an assembly? How will we deal with those questions? So we solve these 5 common failures through a predict, plan, perform process. We identify and involve the groups that you see on the screen. We then set up what-if exercises and establish how we're going to monitor and communicate at each step through the process. Now, we push all of this into a framework, and I think we've shared this with you in other webinars, but I want to spend a minute now, because if you're going to take a look at where you are, you've got to understand what you're doing when. There are 5 stages of escalation in a crisis. First is the pre-action. That's all the planning that you do in advance, like attending today's webinar or participating last month in the virtual exercise, or getting your plans written down, having a training session, having an exercise, getting the supplies in. All of those elements occur before the event. When the event occurs, you're at the onset point, and your focus is on life and health and safety at that point in time, and that's where your emergency response plan comes in, and the standard protocol. That's the shelter in place, the evacuate, the lockout, the lockdown, so that everyone understands their role at those points in time. Now, as soon as that event has occurred, normally the event is short-lived. It's the length of time and of the consequences associated with that we want to also focus on. So how bad it is will be dealt with in an impact assessment, and we generally do that at 2 levels. Initially, it's a high-level assessment. Did this affect many areas? Was it only a single classroom? Was it just one student? Was it something that impacted the structural security of our school? What's the element associated with it? Once we've done that preliminary assessment, if it's minor, it's going to be a return back to running our school as we normally would, fairly quickly and easily. If it's complex, if it's a bigger problem, now then we'll have to do a more detail. If we're going to have to we can't hold classes in our building now, where are we going to go? What are we going to do about that? You would declare a crisis. You'd activate your crisis management plan. And that's generally strategic, thinking about the business implications of running our school and carrying forward. And then on a departmental basis, we would have individual continuity plans, just like a business would, of how do we get this started. Can we do remote learning? The computer has certainly been a big help here to provide you at least a short-term alternative, or do you have a reciprocal arrangement with a church or a school in your area, where if you needed to for a short duration that you could go there and run classes. And then after those 4 phases are over, that 5th phase is looking at the post-recovery. What are the consequences of this? What are the lessons learned? What do we need to do to go back and update our plan and carry forward? So we take those activities at that point in time, and that would give us the additional element to bring that together. So this 5-step activation in a crisis, these 5 stages, everything you see on your screen we're going to be doing, identifying and anticipating those threats, having the intelligence network so that we're ready to go, having the response team there to act basically when we see those triggers reached around the areas that we are monitoring, whether it's a behavioral trigger or a physical trigger or a trigger around a weather event or another exposure. We coordinate that with all the programs within our school, identify primary and alternative assignments. We recommend following HR rule 1, 2, 3. You need to be 3 deep at every position. This is going to be my primary spokesperson. This is my backup. Here's my second backup. Because in those situations, the first person may have been injured, may not be available that day. You'll need to go to the next and then the next. Now, I mentioned spokesperson, and one of the recommendations that we have is if there is a crisis that the primary spokesperson is not the head of school initially. There will be an opportunity for the head of school to talk later, but we really want the head of school helping and focusing on the critical decisions that have to be made as we go through that process. We document the response actions for the most likely threats. If we know we're in a tornado area, what's our response action? If we know we're in a flood area, what's our response actions? And then document the criteria and activation levels for each one of the types of events that we are associated with. And again, I'm going to show you a tool on the next slide that will help in that area. And then generate those procedures that we're going to carry forward. And we're going to give you a couple of different types of risk in the second half of our webinar today that I want you to think about focusing on. Now, I promised you some tools, and so let's go on and get to those. The first tool that you see is a hazard impact matrix form. Now, what you do is you would create a spreadsheet, and in the left-hand column would list the type of an event, the flood, the tornado, or the other action. And then you would, next, what is your estimation of the probability that that's likely to occur? Is it very low? Does it go all the way to very high? Onset speed. How quickly does it come onto us? How much warning do we have before warning? How long is it going to last? The duration, the intensity, how intense is it? And then we focus on impacts, the people impacts, the human impact, the property impact, the business impact, and then the total impact on the school, taking those numbers together. And then if you add all of these up and multiply them up, what's the relative risk score for that particular exposure? Now, the higher the score, then the more you want to make sure that you've addressed every exposure to it. If it's a very, very low score, it's probably going to be something that you won't get to initially. But eventually you want to be able to address everything, because even though it's a low relative risk, it could still in fact occur. But we want to deal with those that are highest first. Now, we find it's easier to start to think about this in 4 buckets. The first bucket is natural. That could be the tornado, the flood, the winter storm. The second would be biological. This could be a hazard spill that occurs. It could be the communicable illness. We've already had a school this fall that had a digestive flu that went through the school. We've had a measles outbreak. So it doesn't have to be a pandemic for it to be biological and coming in to impact your school. From a technology standpoint, cyber risk is a growing exposure. You've got a great deal of financial information about the parents and the students in your school. The protections around that now are growing that you would need to have. And finally, the human-induced hazards. That could be the violence, bullying, cyberbullying, hazing, battery, all of those types of elements, as well as the accident that occurs. There was a story on the news yesterday of speeding through school zones at the start of school. So if you rank all of those, and then for everything that you've identified, putting the programs in place to deal with it becomes very important. Now, the tool at the bottom of the page is called an event activation matrix. Now, as you group the types of risks together, you would put those in the left column, and then across the other 3 columns talk about who is going to be in charge of those areas, and is it a minor, a moderate, or a major event? And as you move into these minor incidents all the way up to crises, you have different level of involvement within your school and within your system to handle that. And clearly, if it's a crisis level event, the senior leadership, the head of school, your principals are involved, ultimately your board, in being prepared to answer in those. And if you define the criteria in each one of the blocks in creating your own activation matrix, that's a single sheet that can be distributed to everyone in the school, so that if we recognize it, if we're aware, then we can activate and get into our plans much quicker and on an accelerated basis. Another way to look at that matrix that's involved is the next slide. The 3 levels of events are categorized. If it's a low-level event, a level 1, then the teacher could handle it, or the emergency personnel there at school. If it's up that next level, more of a moderate event, you've got an incident response team that's been identified to help within the school. If it's a category 3, it's that high-level crisis that's involved in it, something that could directly impact a student, a death of a student, a sexual assault, or a larger scale event, then that's the crisis management team, the larger strategic group within the school, and ultimately the board of directors, and then you'd have support around communications at every one of these levels that would come together. So defining this in advance instead of having to invent it as the events occur become extremely important. Now, what I want to do is to take you one step beyond this. If we're going to be looking at where we are and judging, I want to expose you to one other level of thought that you probably haven't thought about when you think about the safety and preparedness of your school, and it's a chance to move to that next level. And that's talking about continuity and resilience. And when we think about business crisis risk, and our school is a business, we collect tuition, we pay teachers, we have expenses. We've got to think about maintaining that school as a functioning entity. And so we're going to look at the structural design, the operational activities, and the functional processes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a couple of minutes, because anything that happens in those areas can be disproportional with its impact on our students, our people, our profitability, our brand, and our reputation. And our goal, just like with any of the others, is to identify it before they occur. Our focus and takeaway I'd like you to have from today's conversation is around this concept of before now. You want to know before now. And again, we don't want it to become that surprise that comes in and forces us to react when we're behind. We want to be able to do what we can, in many cases, to prevent or even mitigate it. So if we think about the embedded business crisis risk across those three areas, structural would be, say, how we're organized, the communications and information and the behaviors of senior leadership. The example that I shared earlier about the student who had been expelled and was readmitted, two people in school said, well, they apologized, and so we decided we'd let them back in. And they'd had no review from a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist indicating that the student was no longer a threat to themselves and another. Having that student readmitted triggered the victim's family, the student's parents who had been attacked, to go to the police because they were concerned about what would happen. And so suddenly the brand and reputation of the school became a key factor. Operationally, how do we handle the basic business processes? What's going to happen if we have to close our school because of a communicable illness outbreak? Are we refunding tuition? What's going to be our policies and procedures? And then finally, the functional flow of information across it. Does information get siloed in your school? Some people know, some people don't know. How do we process that information across within the organization? We regularly find schools where information is used as a weapon because one area knows and they're reluctant to share that information. We want information to flow through the school so that if we have a student that's a potential concern to themselves or others, that's known, and so that we can intervene early into the process. So why is this important? Well, because these crises can be foreseen. And if they can be foreseen, in many cases, we can then prevent or mitigate the event from occurring. And so we're looking at indicators. And those indicators go way back to where we started our conversation today, and that's about the intelligence network. If we are looking for and monitoring for certain information, and that information comes to us, that's an indication that what we're concerned about is starting to occur and that we can intervene before the impact becomes even greater. Now we're going to organize this now in a little bit tighter format. So let's first start thinking about complexity of a crisis. How complex is this? Is it a targeted crisis? It's easily identifiable, and it's not complex because it's got everything in place. If we don't manage it well, it could certainly escalate, but we would know. If we had a discipline problem with a single student, that might be a crisis for a few minutes, but once it was under control, it was dealt with. How we mitigate this, it's fairly a straightforward process. But if it's more complex, that there are many attributes, if we've had a cyber breach and the financial information of our parents has been disseminated, if it's something that's going to affect multiple people, multiple of events suddenly can be linked together and shown as a pattern that the media becomes involved. It's a much more complex and difficult process for us to handle. So now let's look at, we've looked at the complexity question, let's look at the reactive question. If it's something that we have to react to, we're focused on the event, but the whole organization isn't consumed. If we had that one student with a behavioral problem, it doesn't affect the other classes where the student currently isn't in. We'd have to look then specifically at what we're doing for that particular one compared to something that affects the entire organization, a significantly more complex event. Now, this could be a targeted event. If we have a tornado threat, we're all going to be reacting at the school at the same time. We're all going to be trying to move to the safe area and what we're looking to do. There are other complex things, though, that can drive us in even a greater sense of urgency about the survivability of our school. So let's talk about that for a moment. So we took these two axes, the complexity and the urgency, and we put them on a grid. The blue box is where you have focused with your team around the events that happen in your school. This is the armed intruder. This is the winter storm. This is the targeted event that comes in, and speed is quality, and there's a fairly significant pathway that we can clear of what we need to do to resolve those events. Now, below that, you'll see a difficult business crisis. There's some disruption in our performance. We haven't had good communications. There have been some control failures that we have within the process. I visited a school where as they were taking attendance, the calls to home for a student missing didn't come until the afternoon. So we could have some failures there in the communications that would allow that problem to escalate. Chronic is where it's been there for a while, so it moved from difficult to the right over into chronic, and that's the business crisis. It's systemic within the organization. Poor metrics and even some fraud and gradual deterioration would develop. And then if it's left still out of control, then we get others. It could affect the accreditation or the brand and reputation of the school. The bank could call the loan, the very survival of the organization, and it's a death spiral when we get into that extreme urgency and complex quadrants. And so in those three quadrants, the green, the orange, and the red, it tends to move to the right and up at that point in time. So what we want to do is to intervene in that area while it's still a difficult business crisis. It's still targeted and reacting and urgent, and our interaction will cause that problem to de-escalate. We responded last year to a school who'd run into some financial difficulty, and they had spent the money they had in reserve to be paying the teachers for the summer of those that were on a 12-month contract, and they were trying to decide who to pay and who not to pay, and could they open in the fall. And there was a lack of financial controls, and it proceeded to move through those processes. We're dealing with a couple of schools right now whose enrollment is down, and it's been a pattern that it seems to be down this year from last year and down from the year before. And so that could be an indicator of some control issues in the school, some perceptions of the parents and how it's operating. A declining enrollment is the indication of a business crisis within the school. And so that's one area that we can use to measure to look at the impacts associated with it. In working with the school over the summer and into the fall, their enrollment was down considerably, and it was enough to impact their ability to hire teachers and perform within their school. And as we looked at some of the issues that they were dealing with and some of the rumors that were occurring about the school, that was driving who they were and defining the brand of that school and impacting it over time. So historically, when we think about preparedness in schools and we think about safety, we think about that acute business crisis, that blue box that you see up there. The big challenge that I see for you and your team as those other areas start to emerge and playing a role within your school of being able to deal with those particular exposures. So looking at creating actionable intelligence and how we carry that to the next level so that we know before now, we need a dynamic risk process. You need to do the audits, get involved, have the boards and management understand the indicators to see that these elements were concerning. Looking at physical security, social media intelligence, having an intelligence network, and those statistics are staggering. If you have a problem in your school, it's being talked about on social media, and if you're not monitoring it, you're not aware. And this is more than looking at your school Facebook or web page. This is the conversation that's going on that's out there, and you can have that intelligence to be aware of that problem. Action indicators, so if we see this, we're going to take that action, and then finally communications to solve those problems as they come together. So all of that is being dealt with in a predict, plan, perform methodology, a chance for you to control what's occurring within your school so that we're not in a situation that everything becomes a surprise. So if we wanted to summarize it, it's the if issue. If this happens, what are we going to do? If is going to occur, what warning do we get? So focusing on the if, knowing before now, becomes an extremely critical aspect of it. And the way we start to focus our interest and involvement is looking at first the consequence. We did that hazard impact measurement there. If this is the type of thing that could cause our school to fail, that our parents would withdraw their students if there was a scandal in these elements, if children didn't feel safe there, if there were repeated exposures to the same types of problems, then we need to be able to measure that and take action So focusing on the consequences of those becomes one of the first things that we would do in looking at your plan. Secondly, looking at our plans both from a tactical and a strategic. Tactical would be those actions that we would take immediately at onset, the standard protocol, lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, evacuate. Strategic is trying to make those decisions about what do we do now that the student has exhibited a behavior of concern, now that we see a problem with the teacher. As we've talked in many of these webinars, annual background checks are the standard and best practice in the market today. We were responding to a school and I asked to see the recent background check on the teacher. The last background check was 4 years old. So they had no idea of what was going on with this particular teacher and what this teacher was doing. By the way, we found out that teacher had auditioned for a role in a reality TV show. And the name of the reality TV show was Naked and Afraid. I don't think that's who I want to have representing my school at this point in time. Then we look at the business crisis risk. How are we doing? Are there indicators that we're growing as a school or are we declining as a school? Are there turnover issues? Are there some concerns that we have not really dealt with? Do we have an intelligence network that alerts us as these events start to occur so that we take the appropriate actions in each of the areas? And do we have instant access tools? And the acronym IT, instant tools, is what I want you to focus on. It used to be we'd look and get our plans into binders and they'd sit on a shelf, but no one's going to be lugging around a big, thick binder with a bunch of boilerplate information about the FEMA website and responding to the incident command structure in that area. People want actionable tools. Today, you can have your teachers all have the emergency plan downloaded onto their smartphone so they can look at it, have a checklist, that they could have the attendance list for their class if they're trying to do an evacuate and you're trying to count people's noses to know that you have everyone located, having a reunification plan in place. The standard now is to have it on your smartphone, that device, because it works if the internet's down because it's been downloaded to the phone. The phone is charged, so it works if the electricity is on. So having your plans in the hands of your teacher so that they're able to make those decisions becomes extremely critical. I would encourage you to contact Firestorm to learn how to do a variety of things. The next time we have a virtual exercise, I would recommend that your school participate that just as we did last month. Have them sit around the conference room and go through and make the decisions about what they know, what they're concerned about. What are they going to do? What are they going to communicate? What are they going to monitor? And see how they work together as a team. There's two ways to test your plan. You can test your plan now and at your convenience, or you can test it in an actual emergency crisis or disaster. I recommend you don't do the latter. Let's test the plans now to find out if there are gaps and have those gaps addressed. You can align your plans to standards and best practices. That's the assessment or the gap analysis that we talked about earlier. You need to create your own intelligence network. For every threat or risk that you have identified, what is your intelligence network to monitor for that threat or risk? If you have any doubt, that can be done now, and it can be done inexpensively. That will provide you more control than any other step that you can take. And then finally, schedule training. The monthly webinar sponsored by RenWeb, attending the annual user conference and participating in the workshops, getting the training within your school can make a significant difference as we do those areas. We'd like to thank RenWeb for underwriting this webinar series and providing the information to you each month. And again, your RenWeb system is a key tool here. You can have your plans stored onto the system. You can develop programs to track behaviors of concern. And you can have notification built into that system. So if you've got questions about today's webinar or anything else at Firestorm, you can go to our website at firestorm.com and fill out a contact form and we'll be in touch. Or you can send us an email at webinars@Firestorm and we'll be glad to be back in touch with you. Or you can pick up the phone and give us a call at 800-321-2219. We're going to try to reach out to everybody on today's phone call to answer questions. I thank you for everything you're doing every day in your school to make that school safer and better. Thank you all. Have a wonderful fall, and I look forward to speaking with you again next month. Jim Satterfield wishing you a great fall. Goodbye.